It was my father's 70th birthday. The Lindley family had gathered at our old countryside estate in Vermont, a place that always smelled like polished wood, dried roses, and restraint. The house was buzzing with chatter and piano music. The table was already full: roast lamb, green bean casserole, and Clara's signature lemon meringue pie. Everyone had arrived early, dressed up and glowing with the pride of being part of a traditional, respectable family. Everyone but me. I parked my old sedan in the far end of the gravel driveway, took a breath, and stepped out with a homemade chocolate cake and a small, wrapped gift. As I pushed open the heavy oak door, the room turned to look. Some smiled politely, most just blinked with mild surprise. Clara, my older sister, spotted me from across the dining hall and wasted no time. She raised her wine glass and called out, her voice cutting through the chatter like a polished knife. "Well, look who finally made it." "Still playing house with your cats, Grace?" A wave of light laughter followed. Someone chuckled, someone else whispered something I couldn't hear. I felt the sting but smiled, steady as ever. "At least they don't complain about late dinners," Clara added with a smirk. That got another round of laughs. I stepped inside, kept my chin level, and placed the cake on the dessert table without a word. My mother walked by, adjusted a flower vase, and murmured just loud enough for me to hear, "Try not to bring your alternative lifestyle drama today, okay?" Her words stung more for their casualness than their cruelty. This wasn't new. I'd learned to swallow the bitterness years ago. My family didn't hate me, they just didn't know what to do with me. A single woman in her mid-30s who didn't teach, didn't marry, didn't have children. Just cats. That was their shorthand. Pickles and Bean, my companions, my stability, my supposed shame. I made my way around the room, greeting a few aunts, uncles, cousins. Most conversations were short, strained, the kind that die after obligatory pleasantries. Clara's voice carried as she described her daughter's recent ballet recital. Someone mentioned real estate. Someone else made a joke about avocado toast and millennials. I checked my phone. It was nearly 4. I glanced toward the front of the house. That was when the old gate bell rang. Everyone froze. No one had used that gate in years. Heads turned toward the window. I stepped to the foyer and looked out. A black SUV was making its way up the long driveway. It stopped just shy of the main porch. The driver's door opened and Mark stepped out, calm, grounded, and so familiar. He walked to the back seat and carefully lifted out a sleeping toddler, wrapped in a fleece blanket. The child stirred. Mark kissed the boy's forehead and walked toward the house. I turned back into the room. The conversations had quieted. People watched me now, unsure why I was moving toward the door like I was expecting someone. The front door opened. Mark stepped in. His voice was quiet but certain. "Time to see Mama." The little boy lifted his head. His eyes landed on me. "Mommy," he said, wriggling out of Mark's arms and running straight into mine. I lifted him easily. His head found my shoulder. His arms clung to my neck. The room went silent. Chairs stopped creaking. Glasses stopped clinking. The weight of their disbelief was a sound all its own. I stood in the center of the dining hall, holding my son, and for the first time in years, maybe ever, I wasn't the one who felt out of place. They were. "My name is Grace Lindley. I'm 36 years old. In most family conversations, I exist in the footnotes, somewhere between how's your little decorating hobby and is she still living with those cats? I grew up the second daughter in a quiet, respectable New England family. My sister Clara was the golden one from the start. She had the tidy blonde curls, the straight A's, the violin recitals. I was the imaginative one, always painting something, asking too many questions, or daydreaming instead of practicing piano. While Clara collected awards and attention, I collected journals, odd trinkets, and the sort of books that got me called quirky. Our mother, Helen, was never cruel, but she had a clear idea of what a woman's life should look like. Get a degree, find a nice man, settle into a home filled with church calendars, casserole recipes, and children. She loved us both, but with Clara, love came easily. With me, it came with concern and confusion. By the time I was 10, I already understood that approval had a dress code. Clara dressed like a catalog and got compliments. I wore mismatched socks and drew on my jeans. I got size. I don't say this to blame them, they weren't trying to be hurtful, but when love is filtered through expectation, The absence of praise starts to feel like shame, and shame, when unspoken, becomes identity. Clara followed the script perfectly. College, fiancé, wedding at 24, first baby at 26. She lived just 2 towns over, had a husband who coached high school football, and never missed a family gathering. At Thanksgiving, she brought apple pie and monogrammed napkins. I brought wine and questions about art exhibits. When I turned 30 and moved to Boston to work full-time as an interior stylist, my parents were supportive in the polite, distant way you support someone studying interpretive dance. It sounded frivolous, temporary. My mother's favorite line was, "Just make sure you have something to fall back on." I didn't want something to fall back on. I wanted to build something to stand on. But that idea never landed well in a family that measured success by marriages and mortgages. I didn't resent them for their path. I just didn't want it. And every time I said that out loud, Clara would smile like she pitied me. She always had a talent for that, passive-aggressive encouragement. "Oh, Grace, I wish I had your freedom. I don't know how you manage on your own. I'd be lost without someone to take care of the heavy stuff. Still playing house with your cats?" That one was her favorite, especially in front of others. At first, the comment felt like harmless teasing. The first time she said it, I laughed. I said, "Well, they're tidier than most men." But over time, the joke became a label. Family friends would bring it up. An aunt once asked me, "So, how's the cat castle coming along?" One cousin sent me a mug that said, "Crazy cat lady" in gold cursive. I laughed with them. I always laughed, because silence would have been worse. But inside, I was exhausted from constantly being seen as incomplete. My work was my pride. I wasn't famous, but I was good. I styled boutique restaurants, renovated quirky short-term rentals, and created spaces people felt something in. I had a client list that grew entirely by word of mouth. I worked long hours, lived modestly, and poured myself into building a life that felt like mine. And yes, I lived with 2 rescue cats, Pickles and Bean. They were the only creatures that greeted me every night like I mattered, that purred when I came home, that didn't ask why I wasn't married yet. Still, I was alone. Not in a tragic way, in a full, quiet, chosen way. I had friends, a rhythm, a peace that made sense to me, but family gatherings reminded me that my version of fulfillment was still seen as a waiting room for the real thing. They saw my apartment as a temporary phase, my life as a dress rehearsal. No one ever asked what my days looked like. No one ever asked why I loved my work. My mother once suggested I apply for a receptionist job, just to have something steady. Clara said she envied how much time I must have for yoga. Every compliment was laced with misunderstanding. Then, 2 years ago, everything changed. A client referral brought me to Portland. I was hired to redesign the common area of a historic bed and breakfast recently purchased by a structural engineer named Mark Reed. Mark was quiet, kind, and, like me, a little tired of explaining his life to people who didn't understand it. He was a single father. His wife had passed away when their son Eli was just a baby. He wasn't dating, wasn't looking, neither was I. But something happened between us, something unhurried. He brought coffee to our morning meetings. I started staying late to tweak lighting angles and play music while we worked. He told me about Eli, not just the facts, but the emotion. He didn't just love his son, he centered his life around him, with a kind of humility that undid me. When I met Eli for the first time, it was like the world recalibrated. This small boy with his toy fire truck and oversized rain boots looked up at me like I was a new planet in his orbit. At first I was careful. I didn't want to impose. I didn't want to be one more visitor in his little life. But Eli had other plans. He followed me around the house asking questions. He asked if my cats could talk. He asked if I'd come back again tomorrow. The first time I read him a bedtime story, he fell asleep with his head on my lap. I moved in 6 months later, not out of impulse, but because it made sense. It felt like home. Pickles and Bean adapted faster than I expected. Eli called them the Fluff Brothers. He started calling me Mama Grace. Then, one morning, while I was brushing his hair for school, he said, "You're my mommy now too." And that was that. Mark proposed to me 6 weeks ago, quietly, just us, Eli, and the world we'd built without fanfare. He didn't get on one knee. He just took my hand while we were watching Eli paint on the porch and said, "This feels like family. Let's make it official." We didn't post about it. We didn't announce anything. Not yet. I didn't want their opinions. I wanted one moment where we could just exist in peace. But when my father's 70th birthday party came around, Mark asked me, gently, "Do you want them to know?" I thought about it. I thought about every smirk Clara had made. Every time my mother said, "We're just worried about your future." And I thought about Eli, his soft curls, the way he says mommy like it's the safest word in the world. "Yes," I said. "I think it's time." So we planned. Mark would arrive later, I'd go first. Let Clara talk. Let the room get comfortable in their assumptions. And then, when the moment was right, the truth would walk through the front door. Not as revenge, but as clarity, as family, as proof that a life they had dismissed was more complete than they ever imagined. People always assume the hardest part is starting out. That's only half true. The beginning was hard, sure. I had no money, no backing, no family cheering me on. But the real challenge came later, in the quiet middle stretch, when there was just enough success to keep me going, but not enough to convince anyone else I was going anywhere. After I quit my job at a sterile office cubicle redesign firm, I worked as a dog walker by day and helped a florist friend set up wedding venues on the weekends. My real work, the thing I cared about, was tucked into the late-night hours I spent designing on my laptop, in a tiny studio with peeling paint and a heater that coughed all winter. I wanted to create experiences, not just spaces. I wanted people to walk into a room I'd shaped and feel like it was telling them a story they didn't know they needed to hear. But passion didn't pay rent. Clients canceled, checks bounced. My designs were copied by larger firms who could afford lawyers, while I was still borrowing folding chairs for pop-up events. Clara once joked that I had the most expensive unpaid internship in Boston. I smiled. What else was I supposed to do? Defend the dream she never believed in? I slowly built a name, not in the glossy magazine way, but among small restaurant owners, independent galleries, and boutique cafes who wanted something personal. I made my mark not with marble or crystal, but with light, texture, and quiet drama. By 29, I had transformed 3 failing cafes into cozy spaces people lined up to enter. Not because I advertised, but because the rooms invited you to stay. At 30, I reimagined an old bookstore into a hybrid cafe that earned local acclaim for its ambiance. Then came the pivot. A client of mine, a young chef trying to open his first fine dining concept, invited me to co-design this space. I hesitated. I had no experience in fine dining. But he trusted me, so I trusted myself. The result was Reverie, a dreamy forest-themed restaurant with curb seating, golden shadows, and glass lanterns that glowed like fireflies. It was featured in 3 local food blogs before it even opened. A month later, Boston Scene called it a sensory experience that feels more like a film set than a restaurant. I still remember reading that line while eating reheated noodles on my futon. That article changed everything. Suddenly, I had meetings, people wanted my touch. I was offered a 6-month contract to redesign the common areas of a boutique hotel on the waterfront called the Marlin. I worked 14-hour days, fighting with contractors who didn't take me seriously and sourcing materials that looked rich without costing too much. But the end result was stunning. The owners were floored. They called me the space whisperer. I cried in the supply closet when no one was looking. A year later, I was brought on by the Sinclair Group, a mid-size hotel company trying to revamp 3 underperforming properties. This was the moment everything shifted. Not just financially, though the money was finally real, but emotionally. For the first time, I had creative control at scale. I wasn't just redesigning a room, I was reimagining what the entire guest experience could be. The smallest of those 3 properties was Avalon Bay, a luxury hotel just outside Boston, overlooking the harbor. It was modern, crisp, and light-drenched. Everything Clara used to say felt too cold for a real celebration. I was offered not just the design lead, but partial ownership in exchange for a reduced rate. I said yes, quietly, without fanfare. Around this time, I met Mark. He was an architect consulting for a different project across the city. We crossed paths at a design expo. He complimented my layout of a hotel foyer that used acoustics and lighting to mimic an arrival hush, something I had never heard anyone else pick up on before. He wasn't loud or flashy. He was thoughtful, like me. We talked over tea, then lunch, then late-night walks. It was slow and honest. When he told me he was raising his 2-year-old son, Eli, alone, his wife had passed away from a rare heart condition, I didn't run. I had never seen myself as a mother. But something about Eli's gentle, curious spirit cracked something open in me. Our lives wove together slowly. I taught Illy how to build forts out of throw pillows. He taught me how to find joy in rubber duckies and peanut butter snacks. By the time he was 4, he called me Mama Grace. By the time he was 5, Mark and I shared a mortgage and a rhythm. But none of this made it back to my family. I didn't tell them about Reverie, or the Marlin, or Avalon, or Eli. I didn't tell them about the nights I fell asleep with blueprints in one hand and a child's drawing of our living room in the other. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I had learned long ago that some truths are too sacred to survive casual dismissal. So when I got the group message from Clara about planning Dad's 70th birthday, and she said they were considering Avalon Bay, I didn't blink. My mother chimed in with venue questions. I replied casually, I know someone at Avalon, might be able to help. Within seconds, my mother responded, Don't worry, Clara and Michael will handle it. Let's not stretch you. I stared at that text for a long time. Stretch me, as if paying for a space I co-owned would somehow bankrupt me. As if my entire adult life had been one long failure to measure up to Clara's standards. I didn't respond. I forwarded the message to the general manager of Avalon Bay. I asked him to reserve the Rosewood Ballroom, our most elegant space. I told him to invoice it under my holding company and send the family a standard confirmation under Clara's name. Then I asked him to roll out the red carpet. Literally. I want the main lobby cleared before my arrival. Staff lined up in formal wear. And a red carpet from the valet to the main entrance. He laughed. Shall we announce you with trumpets too? Subtle dignity, I replied. But yes, let them feel it. I didn't tell Clara. I let her feel in control. I let my mother believe I had no role in any of it. I watched the group chat fill with seating charts, playlist suggestions, and food requests. I kept my responses brief. I asked Mark to arrive 30 minutes after me with Eli. I wanted one moment, just one, where I walked in alone, holding my own name like armor. I wasn't looking for revenge. I wasn't there to shame anyone. But I was done being invisible. For years, I'd been told I was playing house. Now I owned the damn house. And on the night of my father's birthday, my family would walk through a space I built with my bare hands, walls I had painted, floors I had chosen, lighting I had designed, and not even know it was mine until I showed them. In the week leading up to the party, I played my role with such quiet precision you might have mistaken me for someone who belonged in the background. Clara predictably took the reins. She coordinated the table settings with an iron will, obsessed over the flower arrangements like the fate of the evening depended on a specific shade of blush rose, and insisted on a salmon entree even though our father had been allergic to salmon since the late 80s. I didn't argue. I just smiled politely and nodded when spoken to, all while finalizing a completely separate set of arrangements behind the scenes. If Clara was choreographing the stage, I was quietly building the theater. The Rosewood Ballroom at Avalon Bay, my ballroom in every meaningful way, was being transformed under my direction, unseen by everyone else. The lighting was adjusted to a soft amber, warm enough to flatter skin tones and gentle enough to highlight the ballroom's classic architecture. I commissioned floral arrangements from a local greenhouse I'd collaborated with before, people who knew how to work with detail and soul. Each napkin was folded into the shape of a blooming camellia, Dad's favorite flower. The bar was stocked with a limited edition whiskey he'd once spoken fondly of during my college years. I'd tracked down 2 bottles through a private collector in Maine, never mentioning it to anyone, because it was never about the praise, It was about getting it right. Meanwhile, the family group chat buzzed with activity. Clara posted updates like a self-proclaimed project manager, seating charts, last-minute headcount adjustments, reminders about the black tie creative dress code she'd invented. I didn't participate much, not because I didn't have things to say, but because I wanted them to continue operating under the illusion they always held, that I was peripheral, incapable of leading, someone to be tolerated but not trusted. It was oddly satisfying to let them speak over a reality they hadn't even begun to imagine. 4 days before the event, my mother sent a brief message. I spoke to the hotel manager today. Very professional, should be a lovely evening. I smiled when I read it. The manager she'd spoken to was under strict instruction not to mention me by name. Not because I had demanded secrecy, but because I preferred the moment of realization to be earned, timed with intention, not scattered across a chain of text messages. 2 nights before the event, I met with the Avalon staff for a private walkthrough. We discussed every element of the evening, the valet sequence, the champagne tray formations, the precise moment the pianist would begin playing Clair de Lune as guests entered the main ballroom. Then came my final instruction. When I arrive, I said, looking at the general manager, I want the doors to remain closed until my cue. Wait until everyone's just inside the ballroom entrance, family, cousins, everyone. Then open the doors wide, red carpet laid, staff in place, 30 seconds of stillness, then the announcement. He blinked only once before nodding. Understood, Miss Weaver. Mark stayed up with me the night before the party. We steamed my dress in the living room, double-checked every single document in the event folder, and sat quietly over herbal tea, the kind of silence that only comes between people who understand one another without explanation. He didn't ask if I was nervous. He didn't need to. Instead, he just said, "Are you ready for them to see you?" I smiled faintly. "Let's see the hotel first. That's how I want it." The next morning, at precisely 9:42 a.m., Clara sent one last message to the group chat. "So excited for tonight. Can't wait to see everyone. Grace, wear something classic. Don't overdo it." I didn't respond. At 5:30 p.m., I stood in front of my mirror wearing a floor-length midnight blue gown. It was simple, tailored, and unbranded. Nothing loud or logoed, but the stitching whispered of legacy, of time invested and lessons learned. I pinned my hair in a low chignon, minimal makeup, and the earrings Eli had once picked out for me at a craft fair. They were glass, not gemstones, but they shimmered with the weight of something earned. I arrived at Avalon Bay 10 minutes before the scheduled start. The valet opened my door with a professional nod and handed me a small cream envelope. "To Miss Weaver, with thanks." Inside, a handwritten note from the executive chef read, "Everything's prepared exactly to your specs. Chef sends his regards." I smiled. As I stepped out of the car, the entryway lay before me like something conjured from memory. The red carpet glowed faintly under the golden lights. The lobby was empty, just as I'd requested, the soft strains of the piano drifting through the air like something sacred. Behind a pillar, I waited. One by one, I saw the silhouettes of my family arrive. Clara, my mother, cousins I hadn't seen in years. They laughed, took photos, sipped champagne. None of them had any idea. From my hidden vantage point, I watched the general manager approach the ballroom doors. Slowly, deliberately, he opened them wide. Inside, guests turned instinctively toward the entrance, expecting perhaps another distant relative or a late-arriving friend. Instead, they saw the line of staff in formation, lights dimming slightly before warming again. And then came the announcement, calm, precise, timed like a heartbeat. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our distinguished guest." Silence followed. A single breath of stillness. Then I stepped forward, unhurried. And for the first time in my life, they didn't turn their heads because I'd said something wrong or showed up in the wrong outfit or forgotten a card. They turned because they had no choice, because I had entered exactly how I intended to, and they had no idea what came next. The house was full by the time I walked in with my little cake box and wrapped gift. Conversations bounced from wall to wall, laughter rising above the soft jazz playing from the living room speakers. Clara had turned the family estate into a curated museum of her domestic success. Name cards at the table, custom party favors with Raymond at 70 printed in gold cursive, and a slideshow looping old photos of Dad with each of his grandkids. Well, almost all of them. Not that anyone noticed the omission. Clara spotted me first, of course. She never missed an entrance. "Well, well," she said from across the room, raising a glass of white wine. "If it isn't our resident cat whisperer. Grace, you made it." She walked over with a confident stride that made her heels click against the hardwood. "Still playing house with your cats?" Her voice was light, amused. I smiled. She wasn't finished. "At least they don't complain when dinner's late, right?" That earned a chuckle from our Uncle Jim. I held up the cake box. "Homemade. Chocolate bourbon with sea salt caramel." "Oh," Clara said, eyebrows lifting. "So Pinterest of you." Our mother drifted by just in time to land her blow. She adjusted a napkin on the buffet table and murmured, "Let's try to keep the lifestyle drama to a minimum today, okay?" She didn't even look at me when she said it. Just floated past in a cloud of Chanel No. 5 in polished judgment. I placed the cake down and walked to the edge of the room, letting myself blend into the wallpaper while the party swirled. Aunt Maggie was recounting a bridge tournament. Clara's husband, Michael, talked about refinancing their lake house. Someone mentioned Peloton. Someone else made a joke about the childless freedom tax bracket, and my name was attached in the laugh. I smiled, sipped punch, waited. The group chat had buzzed for days before this party. Clara posting updates on seating charts, playlist options, dessert selections. She'd claimed authority, as always, with her particular brand of cheerful micromanagement. "Grace, just bring a dessert. Grace, something simple. Grace, let the adults handle the big stuff." And I had agreed. But what no one in that house knew, what no one had even begun to imagine, was that I hadn't come alone. I checked my phone, a text from Mark. 5 minutes. I stepped into the hallway, stood by the entry mirror, and adjusted my earrings. They were delicate blue glass, hand-blown by an artist Ellie loved watching videos of. My dress was plain navy with a fitted waist and soft neckline. No sparkle, no show, but it was me. My heart thudded, but not with nerves. It was something more like release. Then the bell rang. It wasn't the doorbell. It was the gate bell. The one at the old iron gate that no one had used in years. The one that always stuck on cold mornings and creaked like an old secret being told. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. Uncle Jim frowned. Who would use the front gate? I stepped back into the room. My mother had risen from her seat. Clara was already at the window. A sleek, black SUV slowly made its way up the drive. Mark stepped out from the driver's side. Calm, confident. He walked to the back and opened the door. Out came a sleeping child wrapped in a navy fleece blanket. The boy stirred. Mark kissed his temple and whispered something. Then he turned toward the house, walking at a steady, certain pace. From inside, the tension was visible. I stood straighter. The room didn't know it yet, but the story was about to shift. Mark reached the porch. 1 step, then 2. I moved closer to the front door. Clara gave me a look, half curiosity, half annoyance. "Are we expecting someone?" she asked. I didn't answer. The doorknob turned. My mother stood still, arms crossed. The door opened. Mark entered, holding the boy gently. His voice was soft, almost reverent. "Time to see Mama." Eli's head lifted. His eyes scanned the room. Then they found mine. He lit up. "Mom!" The word was clear, sharp, full of trust. He wriggled free from Mark's arms, ran toward me across the room, and leapt into mine like gravity had finally done something right. I caught him easily, his arms locking around my neck, his curls warm against my cheek. "Hi, baby," I whispered. The silence in the room wasn't stun, it was hollow, like a bell had rung and everyone had forgotten how to breathe. Clara froze. My mother's mouth was slightly open. Aunt Maggie blinked like she'd seen a ghost. I kissed Eli's forehead, turned to the room, and smiled. "Everyone, this is Eli. He's my son." The quiet deepened. Then Mark stepped forward, calm as ever. "And I'm Mark, Grace's fiancé." There was a shuffle of movement near the back. Uncle Jim sat down without realizing it. Clara finally spoke. "You're engaged?" For a few weeks now, I said. We didn't announce it, thought we'd wait until the right moment. My mother found her voice. He called you Mommy. Yes, I said, because I am. But you never said. I didn't need to. My life wasn't a secret. Just not your business, until today. I shifted Eli to my other hip. This is the family I built, quietly, without permission, but with love. Real, relentless love. My father stood slowly. He had tears in his eyes. He looks just like you did at that age. He has his mother's laugh, Mark added, and her stubbornness. The crowd began to soften. Someone sighed. Another smiled. The tension gave way to curiosity. I looked around, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the odd one out. I felt exactly where I belonged. After the final toast and applause, the ballroom lights dimmed into a warm dusk. Some guests had started to drift toward the elevators, coats in hand, murmuring compliments. But I stayed where I was, lingering by the long mahogany table where my father sat alone, tracing the rim of his whiskey glass with a thoughtful finger. I walked over and sat beside him without asking. "Dad," I said softly. He turned to look at me, and for a moment I saw not the man who had stood behind my mother's silence all these years, but the man who used to kneel next to me on the porch when I scraped my knees, whispering, "You're stronger than you think, Gracie." He looked tired, but present in a way I hadn't seen in years. This night, he said after a pause, it was unreal. I smiled just a little. It was real, just not the version anyone expected. He nodded. "I think I owe you more than a thank you." "No, you don't." I paused. "But I'd like a real conversation. For once." He looked down at the glass. "I should have asked sooner about your life, your work, everything." "You didn't," I replied, keeping my voice level. "And maybe I should have pushed harder. And I got tired of fighting for space at the table." He nodded slowly. "Your mother? She thought she was protecting you by being hard on you." I let the sentence hang in the air. "Maybe," I said, "but protection without understanding can feel a lot like exile." He didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, a folded brochure. I took it with curiosity. It was for the LC Initiative, our scholarship foundation. And the name wasn't mine on paper, but the initials were. "Your mother showed this to me last month," he said. "Said she thought it was one of the most generous things she'd seen in years. Said whoever was behind it must have had a very big heart." My breath caught. "She didn't know it was you?" I shook my head. "She praised it at dinner once, called it a rare light in a selfish generation." He smiled, faint but real. "You were always a light. Just not the kind she knew how to see." We sat there for a while, two people, finally just speaking. No scripts, no posture. I didn't need him to apologize, I just needed him to see me. And I think he did. Eventually, the room began to empty further, and I stood. "I should say goodbye," he nodded and rose with me. "Grace," he said, "you did good, and not just tonight." I gave him a quiet nod. "Thanks, Dad." As I turned, I spotted Clara by the dessert table. Alone. Scrolling her phone with one hand, the other gripping the stem of her wine glass like it was anchoring her to the floor. Her posture stiffened when she saw me approach. "I'm not in the mood for a lecture," she muttered. "Neither am I," I replied, "but I figured we might at least acknowledge the elephant in the room." She gave a dry laugh. "Which one? The fact that you pulled off the party of the year without telling anyone? Or the part where Mom looked like she swallowed her pearls when you said, 'I own the building'?" "Both, probably." She sipped her drink and sighed. "You could have told me. About your company, the renovations, the hotel, any of it." "And you could have asked," I replied. "But every time I spoke, you turned it into a competition." "Or a joke." She winced. "Okay, fair. You know," I said. "There was a time I would have done anything for your approval. You were the golden child, med school, doctor husband, perfect life. I thought if I just worked hard enough, maybe I could be seen too." "Grace," she started, but I held up a hand. "I'm not saying this to attack you. I'm saying it because I don't want to keep pretending." She was quiet for a moment. Then, to my surprise, she said, "You were never invisible to me, just threatening in a way I couldn't admit. That caught me off guard. What do you mean? You did everything on your own, she said. Without the blueprint, without approval, you created a life outside the script. And somehow, you made it look beautiful. I followed the rules, and sometimes I still wonder if I ever had a real choice. Her voice cracked, barely. I envied you. And envy makes people cruel. I stood silent, letting that sink in. She looked up again. I don't know if we can fix things. Neither do I said, but we can stop making it worse. A long pause, then she extended her hand. No more cat jokes? I smirked. Only if you stop texting me inspirational quotes after criticizing my lifestyle. She smiled, genuinely this time. Deal. A little while later, I found my mother by the bar. She had a glass of untouched champagne in one hand and her purse in the other. Alone, observing. When I approached, she didn't speak. Neither did I, not right away. I stood beside her, watching the lights catch in the glass like tiny sparks. Finally, she said, you made a scene tonight. I turned to her. Did I? Or did I finally enter one? She didn't respond. I waited, let the weight settle. You taught me silence, I said, by example. How to tuck away what doesn't fit. How to smile through condescension. But I unlearned that, slowly, deliberately. She looked at me then, and for once there was no tightness around her eyes. Just age, weariness, maybe regret. I didn't know how to love what I didn't understand, she said. I wanted you safe, respected, conventional. You wanted me obedient. I wanted you welcomed. You can't be welcomed into rooms built to exclude you, I replied, so I built my own. She looked down at her hands. Is it too late? Not for kindness, I said, not for truth. But I don't need your apology, Mom. I just needed the pretending to stop. She nodded slowly. You've become someone I don't recognize. That's okay, I said. I didn't build this life for you to approve of. I built it so I could live inside it. She blinked. Once. Then, in a voice almost too quiet to hear, your father was proud tonight, he told me. I'm not good at this. I know. We stood in silence again. Then she touched my arm briefly, a small gesture, not a reconciliation, but maybe the first honest one in years. As she left the ballroom, I felt a strange calm settle over me, not triumph, not revenge, just stillness, like a door had closed and locked behind me, not to trap, but to protect. Later that night, back in my apartment, I slipped out of the gown and into a robe. Mark was sitting on the couch, thumbing through emails on his phone, but looked up the moment I entered. Well, he asked. They saw me? I said. Really saw me? He smiled. And? It was enough. I sat beside him. Our cat Finley jumped into my lap and curled up without hesitation. I don't think they'll change overnight, I said. Maybe not at all. But you didn't show up for them, he reminded me. You showed up for you. I nodded. And for Dad. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the napkin he'd folded during dinner, the edges still faintly scented with camellias. On it, he'd scribbled in shaky handwriting, to the daughter I didn't know I had until now. My throat tightened. Mark read it and said nothing. He didn't need to. In the quiet, I let myself feel it all. The ache, the release, the silent kind of vindication that doesn't require applause. Later, as I stood on the balcony overlooking the city lights, I whispered to the night. I came back, not to belong, but to stand. And this time, I didn't shrink. For most of my life, I played quiet, played small, not because I lacked the ability to shine, but because I thought dimming my light would make everyone else more comfortable. I let the comments slide, let the silence stretch. I let people define me by what they saw or what they refused to see. And then one day, I stopped asking for a seat at their table and built one of my own. I filled it with everything they said didn't count: grit, independence. I found worth in the corners they overlooked. When I arrived that night, they still thought I was the girl who couldn't afford dinner, the one they whispered about, dismissed, doubted. They had no idea that I'd been building a world without them at its center. And the red carpet? That wasn't about proving anything. It was about reclaiming space, letting the silence speak, letting the room pause, not out of shock, but out of recognition. You see, revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's soft. Sometimes it's a steady walk down a carpet they never thought you'd touch. Sometimes it's the way your father looks at you for the first time and truly sees you. Sometimes it's not needing an apology to feel whole. Family can be complicated, love even more so. But you don't owe anyone a version of yourself that makes them more comfortable with who they are. And you are not required to stay small so others feel big. There is power in being underestimated. Power in showing up gracefully, fully, and on your own terms. So let them laugh, let them whisper, let them assume, and then let them watch.